Welcome to Inside the Middle East Q&A series here at the Middle East Initiative. My name is Sarath Ganji, and I'm a second-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Ganji School, as well as an editor of the Harvard Journal of Middle Eastern Politics and Policy. I'm joined today by Dr. Adnan Shihab-Eldin, Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences and former Acting Secretary General and Director of Research for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Dr. Adnan, thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you,
Terrific. Terrific. To begin, often we hear the American perspective when it comes to changes in the global energy market and how that will affect American engagement with the Middle East and in particular oil exporting countries. I'd like to reverse that point. How do the GCC countries perceive their existing geopolitical relationships in light of North America's increased production of unconventional oil and gas?
Well, there are two aspects to the GCC perspective that are important in this regard. One has to do with whether the changes in the United States will imply a disengagement from the Gulf and the oil-producing countries in general. So that's one important perspective, and it has important consequences and challenges and concerns. The second has to do with the United States being an important player in the security of the world, not just in the Middle East, and how that would affect the Gulf. And these are related, but they are also different dimensions. Let me dwell quickly on the first one. Clearly, from our perspective, the fact that the U.S. will become increasingly an important producer of oil is not necessarily bad. In fact, it's welcome in the sense that we need all producers, potential producers, to produce oil and sell it or use it. Because the resources of the Middle East will remain the cheapest that are available in terms of cost of production. So there is no concern from that point of view on the long term, whether it is the U.S. or anyone else. But the concern would be is the U.S. Dramatically alter its relationship, which has been the cornerstone of security of the Gulf, with the Gulf countries. And that would be something that is not desirable. And that's where the second dimension comes in. The U.S. currently appears to be adapting a policy of not being the super policeman of the world, but a leader of an alliance, a global alliance, to act when there is a need based on consensus. And consensus may not always work. We have examples. 1990, there was a grand alliance established by the United States to liberate Kuwait, but there was no consensus. There were some countries that were not part of that thing. And the U.S., today we see that happening in the Ukraine. What will be the response of the United States to the events of the Ukraine? Would they require a consensus, or would they go with a majority, or would they exercise leadership and just enforce that leadership to try to resolve this thing? That's really what's happening. The U.S. will continue to be interested in the supplies coming from the Gulf. That's our view. Why? Because oil is fungible. Even if the U.S. does not end up not importing much oil from the Gulf, and currently it's not importing much. I think it's importing 1.5 to 2 million barrels, mostly from Saudi Arabia, and it's coming down quickly. The fact that oil is fungible, if there is a threat to supply security from the Gulf to China, that will impact the United States in two ways. First, the U.S. economic growth depends on Chinese economic growth. And second, any shortage of supply of oil to China will have to be compensated from somewhere else, whether it's the United States, whether it is Europe, or whether it's Russia, or because oil is fungible, it moves around quickly.
Terrific, Trevor. That's a great analysis. I appreciate that. Changing topics, I'd like to know more about the domestic implications of these energy trends for the GCC countries in particular. And so how do you think these changes in the GCC's oil and gas industries or in the larger global energy market will affect its immigration policies, namely workforce nationalization, like Qatarization or Emiratization, versus the importation of large numbers of foreign workers from abroad?
Well, it's been well observed that the economic growth of the Gulf countries, which is fueled by oil export revenues, has been dependent to a large extent on having skilled and semi-skilled labor available in the region moving in, whether it's engineers or whether it's administrator or clerk or in the service sector. So the well-being and the development over the last 20, 30 years would not have been possible if we were living in a region where such a labor force was not available, even if you had enough financial resources coming in. If you don't have the manpower, you just simply unreasonably priced manpower. So that perspective, I don't think, will change with the changing geopolitics of energy or the changes in the energy landscape. What are the changes in the energy landscape? We're seeing a revolution in renewable taking place. We're seeing unconventional oil and gas increasing. And we're seeing energy efficiency improvement taking place. These are the three important changes in the energy landscapes. And the only thing that could cause a problem for the Middle East is that if the unconventional oil supply, combined with energy efficiency and renewable, would reduce dramatically the need for oil export from the Middle East, and then that would mean that there will be reduction in the oil revenues. In that case, it would not be possible to continue the development relying on outside labor force. Now, taking the second part of the question, what about the nationalization policies? I think it's clear that you have to develop your human resources. It's natural. And what we have seen in the Middle East, take a country like Kuwait, which has been following this policy now for 50 years, because Kuwait has 30 or 40 years advantage on Qatar and the Emirate in terms of oil production. What is the net effect? We still require large labor force from outside Kuwait because the economic growth is large. So the bottom line, the economic growth is high and large, therefore, even after 30 years, we don't have enough labor force. What you're going to see is a shift in what type of labor force you need, either to the very highly skilled, which we don't have, or to the service sector, which not many people engage in. In between, you're going to see more Qataris, more Saudi Arabians, more Kuwaitis engaged, and less dependence on labor force from outside of the country for those sectors. Engineers, teachers, accountants, investment. But on a very highly skilled, in the oil and gas or in any industry, or in the service sector, you're going to continue to see that dominated by labor coming from outside, mainly from the Indian subcontinent, Egypt, Syria, and maybe the Philippines and Indonesia.
Okay, well, that's actually a terrific segue to my very last question. And this goes to the heart of your current work with the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences and some of the challenges that developing and emerging economies face when dealing with brain drain. So specifically, as Kuwait progresses toward its goal of building a knowledge-based economy, what has KFUS done to develop and retain the intellectual capital needed to drive this effort?
Well, you know, KFAS being a very unique foundation. I say unique because not many people know that it's an alliance between the private sector and the government. Mm-hmm. It's funded by the private sector, but the foundation is chaired by the head of the state, by His Highness the Emir of Kuwait. So that puts a responsibility on KFAS to ensure that the strategic programs it has develop the manpower, the skilled manpower that's needed by the private sector. Because currently most of the employment is in the government sector. And so we focus in our programs on developing the youth to take on science and engineering careers, and to help to develop those who pursue that career. And that's why we have programs in Harvard and MIT and London School of Economics. And the idea is to use these programs at the world top institution, where some of our young graduates can come here, develop their skills on an exchange program, on a training program, or some of our more advanced scholars at the university come join researchers at Harvard, at MIT, at London, to tackle, on the one hand, research on important issues for the country, but do it in a collaborative way with some of the top researchers at the top universities. So we, in our small way, we are contributing to develop the human resources, especially those that are needed by the private sector for the future knowledge economy. Because knowledge economy is not going to be an economy that depends on the government. It has to be dependent on the private sector. The government role is to enable it. And our role, being an alliance between the government and the private sector, is to enable it with a view that the graduates are better equipped and qualified for work in the private sector.
Terrific. It was a pleasure to speak with you, Dr. Adnan.
Thank you
for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure.